Travel back in time to the Viking Age with the iconic Captain America in a gripping tale of bravery, justice, and the harsh realities of war. In The Shield of Odin, Steve Rogers finds himself in the midst of a deadly battle against a tyrannical warlord. Armed with nothing but his modern knowledge and an ancient shield forged by the gods. As he fights alongside his newfound Viking brothers, Steve struggles with the morality of his actions and questions whether the cost of protecting the innocent is too high. Get ready for an epic adventure full of action, drama, and heart in this thrilling sleep story. And don't forget to subscribe and like this video for more original stories. The warehouse was quiet, save for the sound of Captain America's boots striking the cold concrete floor. Steve Rogers had fought Hydra many times before, but tonight felt different. He could sense that something was off, that this fight was going to be harder than the ones that had come before. He tightened his grip on his shield and took a deep breath, readying himself for whatever was to come. As he approached the Hydra base, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. As he rounded a corner, he saw them waiting for him. The Hydra soldiers were armed to the teeth, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Steve tightened his grip on his shield, feeling the familiar weight of it in his hand. He charged forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The enemy soldiers ahead of him seemed to multiply as he approached, but Steve didn't falter. He knew that his comrades were counting on him to lead the charge and secure victory for their kingdom. The fight was intense and brutal, but Steve was no stranger to violence. He moved with a speed and grace that belied his muscular frame, ducking and weaving as he fought off his attackers. His shield was a blur of motion, deflecting bullets and knocking aside knives with ease. The attackers were taken aback by his skill and seemed to hesitate for a moment, giving him the opportunity to strike back. With a swift movement, he disarmed one of them and knocked him to the ground, causing the others to retreat. But just as he thought he had the upper hand, something strange happened. A bright light enveloped him, blinding him for a moment. When it faded, he found himself standing in a completely different place. The air was cool and damp, and the ground beneath his feet was soft and spongy. He gazed about, attempting to make sense of his surroundings, but everything seemed alien. He gazed about, soaking in his surroundings. The air was filled with the sounds of war, the clash of swords and the moans of the injured. He saw a troop of soldiers racing at him, their faces contorted in fury and bloodlust. His pulse pounded as he strengthened his grasp on his own sword, ready to protect himself. He took a deep breath and prepared himself for the onslaught of their strike. For a minute, Steve was frozen. He had no idea where he was or how he had gotten there. But as the Vikings came closer, he knew that he needed to fight if he wanted to survive. He hastily surveyed his surroundings for any weapons he might employ and noticed a thick wood resting nearby. Taking a deep breath, he readied himself for the impending struggle. He evaded their initial few assaults, aware that they were shocked by his agility. Then he fought back, using his shield to deflect their strikes and his fists to strike back. Despite the turmoil surrounding him, he was able to maintain his wits about him. He realized that he had to protect himself and his comrades, and he refused to let terror take control. With each strike he struck, his confidence grew greater, and he felt more determined than ever to emerge triumphant. When the struggle was ended, he found himself encircled by the Vikings. They were gazing at him with a mix of distrust and interest, their rifles still at the ready. He gently lifted his palms in surrender, wanting to show that he meant no harm. As he stood there, he couldn't help but ponder how he had landed himself in this scenario. "Who are you?" one of them questioned, watching Steve cautiously. Steve took a long breath, attempting to remember the small bit of Old Norse he had learnt from Thor. "I am Steve Rogers," he continued slowly, his accent horrible. "I came from another place and time." The Vikings stared at each other, whispering among themselves. Steve knew that he needed to make them understand that he wasn't a threat. He gently lifted his hands in a sign of peace and spoke in a quiet voice, wanting to express his peaceful intentions and prevent any physical conflict. The Vikings appeared to relax a little and listened closely to what he had to say. "I intend you no harm," he replied, holding up his hands. "I simply want to know where I am and how I can return back to my own time." The Vikings remained silent for a time, then one of them came forward. She was a lady, tall and fierce-looking, with long hair and a battle-scarred face. "I am Astrid," she added, gazing him up and down. "We are battling against a guy named Gunnar. If you want our aid, you must fight alongside us." Steve paused for a time, then nodded. He understood that he couldn't just stand by and watch innocent people suffer. Throughout the following 2 days, Steve trained with the Vikings and learned more about their way of life. He observed the violence and cruelty of their society, but he also saw the honor and spirit that inspired them to fight. He began to realize the intricacy of this universe and the hardships that lied ahead. When the Vikings and Steve fought in a series of fights with Gunnar's army, Steve began to win the respect and affection of his new comrades. He demonstrated himself to be a great warrior, but more significantly, he showed that he was prepared to risk his life for the people around him. Steve's bravery and dedication spurred the Vikings to fight harder, and they came to view him as one of their own. Together, they continued to fight back Gunnar's army, desperate to safeguard their country and people. At the end of the chapter, Astrid approached him with a tiny package. Steve gazed at the tiny box that Astrid had handed him, wondering what may be inside. He unwrapped it cautiously, displaying a gorgeous sword with a hilt made of solid gold. "Wow," Steve remarked in awe. This is wonderful. Is it truly intended for me? Astrid nodded. Yes. Steve. You have proved yourself to be a great fighter and a real friend to our people. This sword is a symbol of our trust and respect. Steve grinned, feeling a sense of pride and duty. He realized that he had a lot to live up to, but he was determined to do his best. As they prepared for the upcoming battle, Steve began to observe the disparities between his own fighting technique and that of the Vikings. They relied on physical force and power, but Steve preferred to use his agility and quickness to outmaneuver his opponents. Steve knew that he needed to change his plan if he wanted to be successful in combat against the Vikings. He chose to combine some of their skills into his own fighting style while still preserving his agility and quickness. He started to adapt some of their skills into his own training, learning how to utilize his shield and sword together in a way that he had never believed possible. He was particularly impressed by the immense physical power and endurance of the Vikings, who seemed to be able to battle for hours without pausing. As he continued to train with the Vikings, he grew to appreciate the necessity of mental fortitude in combat, recognizing that their fearless attitude was just as vital as their physical ability. He came home a stronger and more well-rounded warrior, due to the lessons he had learned from his Viking instructors. Throughout their training, Steve also got to meet the other members of the Viking clan. There was Bjorn, a large and strong man with a bushy beard and a booming chuckle. He was always eager for a good fight and was the first to give Steve a mug of mead after a victorious combat. Then there came Freya, a gorgeous young woman with long blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. She was a talented archer and had a calm, restrained attitude that belied her intense fighting spirit. Freya was recognized for her precision with the bow and arrow, and she could hit a target from extraordinary distances. Despite her unassuming attitude, she was a great asset to whatever combat she engaged in. Lastly, there was Eric, a grizzled warrior who had fought in many conflicts and had the scars to show it. Thor was a mentor to Steve, teaching him the ins and outs of Viking battle and gave him advice on how to be a leader. Eric's expertise and skills were vital to the success of the Viking attacks, and his presence on the battlefield encouraged confidence in the other fighters. Steve looked up to Eric with awe and respect, hoping to one day become as competent and knowledgeable as his instructor. As the days went, Steve grew to appreciate the camaraderie and feeling of purpose that he found among the Vikings. He felt like he had finally found a place where he belonged, and he was eager to serve them in any way he could. Despite the initial cultural shock, Steve was able to adjust to the Viking way of life and even picked up some of their rituals and language. He realized that he had found a true home with these folks and was thrilled to see what experiences awaited him in the future. One day, while they were ready for war, Astrid approached Steve with a serious expression on her face. "Steve," she began, I need to talk to you about something serious. It affects the fate of our people." Steve nodded, knowing the gravity of the situation. He accompanied her to a distant section of the camp, where they sat down on a log to converse. "A few weeks ago," Astrid started, "we received information that Gunnar has been manufacturing a formidable weapon. It is supposed to be capable of leveling entire towns with a single blast." Steve's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's horrible. We have to stop him." "I agree," Astrid answered, "but it won't be easy. Gunnar has many dedicated followers, and his army is well equipped and well trained. We will need all the aid we can get if we are to succeed." Steve nodded, recognizing the immensity of the task before of them. Yet he also realized that he couldn't back down now. He had come too far and had too much involved in this struggle. "We can do it," he remarked, his voice full of resolve. "We can stop Gunnar and save your people. I won't let you down." Astrid grinned, her eyes gleaming with pride. "I know you won't, Steve. You're one of us now, and we'll stand together to the end." With those remarks, Steve felt a feeling of belonging and purpose that he had never experienced before. He knew that this struggle would be the most significant of his life, and he was ready to give it everything he had. Steve took a deep breath and walked forward, ready to do his best. He had never felt more lively and ready to meet any challenge that came his way. The day of the fight arrived, and Steve and the Vikings marched out to meet Gunnar's army in an open field. The air was heavy with tension as the two sides faced one another, each waiting for the other to make the initial move. Steve could feel his heart racing in his chest as he studied the enemy lines, attempting to predict their tactics. He realized that the outcome of this conflict would determine the fate of his people and their way of life. Suddenly, a booming horn sounded from the Viking side, announcing the commencement of the war. Steve pulled his sword and shield, ready to battle for his new comrades and their cause. The adrenaline surge was obvious as Steve sprinted into the enemy lines, his pulse thumping with every stride. He knew that this struggle would be one of the toughest he had ever fought, but he was determined to emerge triumphant. As the conflict dragged on, Steve could feel his power starting to dwindle. His arms were heavy, and his legs felt like lead. Yet he refused to quit up, knowing that his friends were relying on him. Then, he heard a huge explosion, and a blinding light filled the sky. He shaded his eyes, attempting to make sense of what was occurring. When the light faded, Steve found himself back in the warehouse where he had begun his voyage. He looked about, feeling puzzled and perplexed. "What just happened?" he muttered to himself. He stepped out of the warehouse and into the street, where he observed a throng of people gathered around a giant screen. They were watching a news story about a terrorist assault in the city. Steve recognized that he had been brought back to his own time, and that his voyage to the Viking realm had been a hallucination or a dream. Yet it had seemed so genuine, and he had learned so much about himself and what it meant to be a hero. He looked down at his shield and sword, which he had taken back with him from the Viking world. They were a concrete reminder of the things he had learned and the friends he had made. Steve grinned, experiencing a sense of serenity and satisfaction. He may never know if his visit to the Viking realm had been genuine or not, but he knew that the lessons he had learnt would stay with him forever. Thanks for tuning into Midnight Murmurs for this thrilling tale of Steve Rogers as a Viking warrior in The Shield of Odin, Captain America braving the battlefield. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content like this. Stay tuned for our next video, and until then, happy listening.